Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, 1812.
In September 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte occupied Moscow with his Grande Armée, over 600,000 soldiers, the largest invasion force ever assembled to that point. He expected Tsar Alexander I to surrender or negotiate peace. Instead, the Russians burned Moscow. Most of the city was destroyed by fires, likely set by retreating Russian forces. There was no food, no shelter, and no diplomatic surrender coming. Napoleon faced a choice: winter in the ruins of Moscow with no supplies, or retreat back across Russia before winter arrived in full force. He waited 5 weeks before deciding to retreat. That delay would cost hundreds of thousands of lives.
Napoleon planned an orderly withdrawal along a southern route where supply depots had been established. The army would maintain discipline, protect its artillery and baggage trains, and reach friendly territory before the worst winter weather arrived. The retreat began on October 19, 1812. By November, it had become a nightmare.
What went wrong?
First, the delayed decision. By waiting until mid-October, Napoleon gave winter time to arrive early. Temperatures dropped rapidly. Snow came sooner than expected. Second, the route. The southern supply depots had been destroyed or emptied by Russian forces. Napoleon was forced to retreat along the same path he'd used during the invasion, a path already stripped of food and resources. Third, Russian tactics. Russian forces didn't engage in major battles. Instead, Cossack cavalry harassed the flanks constantly, picking off stragglers, attacking supply wagons, and preventing the French from foraging for food. Fourth, environmental catastrophe. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers lacked winter clothing. Horses died from cold and starvation. Without horses, artillery and supplies had to be abandoned. Frostbite killed thousands. Fifth, collapse of discipline. As conditions worsened, units disintegrated. Soldiers abandoned formations to search for food. Officers lost control. The retreat became a mob of freezing, starving men staggering westward. Sixth, the Berezina River crossing. In late November, the retreating army reached the Berezina River. Engineers built 2 bridges under fire while soldiers fought off Russian attacks. Thousands drowned or were killed trying to cross. The bridges collapsed, trapping rearguard units.
The consequences.
Of the 600,000-plus soldiers who invaded Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it back to friendly territory. Most died from cold, starvation, and disease, not combat. The Grande Armée ceased to exist as a fighting force. Napoleon's aura of invincibility was shattered. Within 2 years, he would be defeated and exiled. The retreat from Moscow became the definitive example of how environmental factors, logistical failure, and delayed decision-making can destroy even the most powerful army. The pattern begins. Waiting too long to retreat eliminates the option of retreat. British retreat from Kabul, 1842.
In January 1842, the British Army occupied Kabul, Afghanistan, as part of their effort to control the region during the Great Game with Russia. Afghan resistance intensified, and the British position became untenable. British commanders negotiated with Afghan leader Akbar Khan for safe passage. The agreement, British forces and civilian dependents, about 4,500 soldiers and 12,000 civilians, would be allowed to retreat safely to India through the mountain passes. It was a trap.
The column would march through the mountain passes in winter, reaching the British garrison at Jalalabad, about 90 miles away. Afghan tribes had promised safe passage. British commanders believed the negotiations were genuine. The retreat began on January 6, 1842, in the middle of winter.
What went wrong?
First, the treachery. The safe passage agreement was never honored. Afghan tribes began attacking the column almost immediately. Second, winter mountain terrain. The passes were covered in snow. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. The column included civilians, including women and children, slowing movement to a crawl. Third, constant harassment. Afghan tribesmen held the high ground along every pass. They fired down on the exposed British column, then disappeared into the mountains before soldiers could respond. Ambushes came at every narrow point. Fourth, no shelter or supplies. The column had inadequate food and no ability to make warm camps. Soldiers and civilians froze to death overnight. Frostbite was epidemic. Fifth, complete vulnerability. Strung out along mountain paths, the British couldn't form defensive positions. Artillery was abandoned. Discipline collapsed as units were cut off from each other. Sixth, massacre at Gandamak. By January 13th, a few dozen soldiers made a last stand near Gandamak. They were surrounded and annihilated.
The consequences. Of the 16,500 people who left Kabul, only one European, Dr. William Bryden, reached Jalalabad alive. He arrived on January 13th, barely conscious, on a dying horse. A few British soldiers and civilians were taken hostage and later ransomed. Everyone else was killed during the retreat. The disaster shocked Britain and led to a second invasion to recover prisoners and restore prestige. Afghanistan earned its reputation as the graveyard of empires. The pattern continues. Trusting enemy guarantees in hostile terrain equals death.
Bataan Death March, 1942.
In April 1942, American and Filipino forces in the Philippines were surrounded on the Bataan Peninsula by Japanese forces. After months of fighting, running out of food, ammunition, and medical supplies, 76,000 Allied troops surrendered, the largest surrender in U.S. military history. Japanese commanders ordered the prisoners marched 65 miles north to prison camps. The prisoners were already starving, diseased, and exhausted from months of combat. What followed was one of the worst atrocities of World War II.
Japanese commanders expected to move prisoners quickly to camps where they could be processed and detained. Prisoners would march under guard. The Japanese military had not planned for the number of prisoners or their condition. No food, water, or medical care was arranged. Japanese soldiers were told prisoners were weak and contemptible for surrendering.
What went wrong? This wasn't a military retreat. It was a death march conducted by captors who viewed prisoners with contempt. First, no provisions. Prisoners received no food or water during the march. Anyone who stopped for water from ditches was beaten or killed. Second, tropical heat and disease. Temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Prisoners were already suffering from malaria, dysentery, and starvation. Many collapsed from heat exhaustion. Third, systematic brutality. Japanese guards bayoneted prisoners who couldn't keep up. Those who fell were left to die or executed. Random beatings and killings were constant. Fourth, no medical care. Wounded and sick prisoners were forced to march. Those too weak to continue were killed on the spot. Fifth, duration and distance. The march took between 5 to 10 days depending on where prisoners started.
Many died within the first few days.
The consequences. Between 7,000 and 10,000 Filipino and American prisoners died during the Bataan Death March. Thousands more died in the camps from disease, starvation, and mistreatment. After the war, the march was prosecuted as a war crime. General Masaharu Homma, who commanded Japanese forces, was convicted and executed. The Bataan Death March stands as a stark reminder that prisoners during retreat have zero control over their fate. The pattern. In captivity, retreat becomes death march when captors have no incentive for mercy.
German retreat from Stalingrad Pocket, 1943.
In November 1942, the Soviet Red Army launched Operation Uranus, encircling the German 6th Army and parts of the 4th Panzer Army at Stalingrad. Approximately 300,000 German and Axis troops were trapped in a pocket roughly 30 miles across. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus requested permission to break out immediately while the Soviet encirclement was still weak. Hitler refused. He ordered the 6th Army to hold position and promised they would be resupplied by air. That promise was a lie that doomed 300,000 men.
Hitler's plan. The 6th Army would hold Stalingrad, while Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe supplied them by air. A relief force would break through the Soviet encirclement and rescue the trapped army. Neither happened. The Luftwaffe couldn't deliver enough supplies. The relief force failed.
What went wrong? First, the airlift failure. The Luftwaffe promised to deliver 500 tons of supplies daily. They never came close. On good days, they delivered 100 tons. On most days, far less. Aircraft were shot down, weather grounded flights, and airfields were overrun. Second, no retreat option. By the time Hitler might have allowed a breakout, the Soviet encirclement had been reinforced. The 6th Army was too weak from starvation and casualties to fight its way out. Third, winter starvation. Rations were cut repeatedly. Soldiers ate horses, then leather, then nothing. Thousands died of starvation. Disease spread rapidly through weakened troops.
The consequences. On February 2nd, 1943, the last German forces in Stalingrad surrendered. Of the 300,000 trapped soldiers, approximately 91,000 went into Soviet captivity. Most died there. Only about 6,000 ever returned to Germany. The disaster at Stalingrad marked the turning point on the Eastern Front. Germany never recovered the strategic initiative. This wasn't a chaotic retreat. It was a slow-motion annihilation caused by a political order that forbade military necessity. The pattern. Political orders that override military reality turn orderly withdrawal into systematic destruction.